In the winter of 1942, the Atlantic Ocean became a hunting ground, and the United States was not ready. Just weeks after Pearl Harbor, Americans believed the war was something distant, fought in Europe, in North Africa, somewhere across the vast ocean. But that illusion shattered when German submarines began appearing off the eastern seaboard. Oil tankers burned within sight of American beaches. Merchant ships exploded in the night. Coastal cities glowed with electric light, silhouetting helpless vessels against the horizon. It was the beginning of what the Germans called Operation Paukenschlag, known in English as Operation Drumbeat, and it was devastatingly effective. Between January and March of 1942, German U-boats sank hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping along the American coast. The U.S. Navy had too few escorts, no organized convoy system, and limited experience fighting submarines in its own waters. German commanders were astonished at how easy it was. Kapitänleutnant Reinhard Hardegen, commanding the long-range submarine 123, described the American coast as a paradise for submariners. Ships sailed alone. Cities failed to enforce blackouts. Targets were everywhere. Washington was stunned. Newspapers reported ship losses almost daily, but the full scale of the disaster was carefully managed to avoid public panic. President Roosevelt and Navy leadership understood something had to change, and quickly. The Battle of the Atlantic was no longer a distant struggle between Britain and Germany. It had reached America's front yard. The Navy explored every possible solution. Convoys would eventually be introduced, along with improved sonar and air patrol coverage. But in early 1942, time was the enemy. Shipyards could not replace lost vessels fast enough. German submarines struck, vanished beneath the waves, and reappeared somewhere else days later. Traditional escorts struggled to catch them. The submarine's greatest weapon was invisibility. Desperation often breeds innovation, and sometimes it revives old, controversial ideas. During the First World War, the British had experimented with Q-ships, armed merchant vessels disguised as harmless cargo ships. Their purpose was simple and dangerous: act as bait. When a German submarine surfaced to finish off what it believed was an easy target, hidden guns would suddenly appear from behind false walls and drop panels, opening fire at close range. The tactic relied on deception, surprise, and nerves of steel. It had worked sometimes, but it was risky, and many Q-ships had been lost with all hands. Now, in 1942, the United States quietly decided to try again. Under a highly classified initiative known as Project LQ, the Navy began converting an ordinary cargo vessel into something far more dangerous. The ship chosen would appear defenseless, slow, and vulnerable, but concealed within her hull would be naval guns, depth charges, and a trained crew prepared to spring a deadly trap. That ship would be commissioned as USS Atik. On paper, Atik looked unimpressive. She had once been a civilian freighter built for commerce, not combat. Her silhouette blended easily among the merchant ships that filled Atlantic trade routes. That was precisely the point. Hidden compartments were constructed to conceal deck guns. Panels were engineered to drop away at a moment's notice. Even her crew would wear civilian-style clothing during encounters, reinforcing the illusion of helplessness. Command of this secret weapon was given to Lieutenant Commander Harry Linwood Hicks. Hicks was not ordered into the mission blindly. He understood what a Q-ship meant. It meant sailing deliberately into submarine-infested waters. It meant pretending to panic under attack. It meant waiting until the enemy exposed itself, often at dangerously close range, before revealing the truth. Timing would be everything. Too soon, and the submarine would dive and escape. Too late, and the Q-ship might be fatally damaged before firing a single shot. The men selected for Atik's crew knew they were volunteering for something unusual, but many details were withheld for security reasons. Secrecy surrounded every aspect of Project LQ. The ship's true purpose was classified. Even within the Navy, only a small circle understood the full mission. If captured, the crew could expect no protection under traditional rules of naval warfare. Disguised warships blurred legal and moral lines, and Germany had previously accused Q-ships of perfidy. For the sailors aboard Atik, the risks extended beyond torpedoes and gunfire. As Atik prepared for sea in early 1942, the broader situation remained grim. German U-boats continued to sink Allied ships at an alarming rate. Hardegen's U-123 alone had already claimed multiple victims during its American patrols. Each success emboldened the Kriegsmarine. Each sinking deepened the urgency within the U.S. Navy. The idea behind Atik was bold. Turn the hunter into the hunted. Lure a U-boat into surfacing. Strike at close range. Send a message that American waters were no longer safe for submarines. But bold ideas in wartime often collide with harsh reality. When Atik finally sailed into the Atlantic, she carried more than hidden guns. She carried expectation. She represented innovation born from crisis. She embodied a gamble that deception and courage could overcome stealth and torpedoes. Out there, somewhere, beneath the gray expanse of the Atlantic, experienced commanders like Reinhard Hardegen were scanning the horizon through periscopes, searching for their next victim. Soon, bait and predator would meet, and what followed would become one of the most tragic and tightly guarded episodes in American naval history.
By early 1942, the United States Navy faced a brutal truth. Conventional tactics were failing in American waters. German submarines were sinking ships faster than they could be escorted, and the psychological impact was almost as damaging as the material losses. Oil slicks drifted toward the coastline, survivors washed ashore. The Atlantic no longer felt like a protective barrier, it felt like an open wound. In response, the Navy quietly pushed forward with one of its most secretive initiatives, known only within a small circle as Project LQ. At the center of this project stood a converted cargo vessel that would be commissioned as USS Atik. To the outside world, she was unremarkable. Her lines were plain, her profile indistinguishable from dozens of merchant ships moving along the eastern seaboard. That anonymity was deliberate. The entire strategy depended on convincing German U-boat commanders that she was defenseless. The concept was not new. During the First World War, Allied navies had experimented with Q-ships, armed decoys designed to lure submarines into surfacing. Submarines of that era often surfaced to conserve torpedoes and use deck guns against merchant ships. Q-ships exploited that habit. Hidden behind collapsible bulwarks and false cargo structures were naval guns, ready to fire at close range. The moment a submarine revealed itself, the illusion would drop, sometimes literally, and the trap would snap shut. But 1942 was not 1918. Submarine tactics had evolved. German U-boats now relied heavily on torpedoes fired from submerged positions. Radar and sonar technology were advancing. The margin for error had shrunk dramatically. Reviving the Q-ship idea was a gamble, and many naval officers were skeptical. Still, desperation outweighed doubt. Converting Atik into a Q-ship required careful engineering. Her deck guns were concealed behind hinged panels designed to blend seamlessly into the ship's structure. Additional armament, including depth charges, was hidden within compartments that could be accessed quickly in combat. Even the crew's behavior was scripted. If attacked, some sailors would simulate panic, lowering lifeboats to create the impression of abandonment. Others would remain hidden at their battle stations, waiting for the signal to reveal the ship's true identity. Command of this unusual vessel was entrusted to Lieutenant Commander Harry Linwood Hicks. Hicks understood that his mission was unlike any standard naval patrol. He would not be escorting convoys or hunting submarines with sonar sweeps. Instead, he would deliberately place his ship in harm's way, hoping to appear vulnerable enough to tempt an enemy commander into surfacing. The psychology behind the tactic was critical. German U-boat captains like Reinhard Hardegen were experienced and cautious. They had already tasted extraordinary success during the early months of America's involvement in the war. Hardigan's patrols aboard U-123 had demonstrated just how exposed American shipping truly was. To deceive such commanders would require flawless performance. A single suspicious movement, a glimpse of concealed equipment, or an unusual radio transmission could cause a submarine to dive and disappear. Secrecy surrounded every aspect of Project LQ. Even within the Navy, knowledge of the mission was restricted. Atik's true role was classified. The crew could not openly discuss their purpose, even with fellow servicemen. If captured, they might be accused of violating accepted rules of naval warfare. Disguised warships occupied a gray area under international law, and Germany had previously protested the use of such tactics. The men aboard Atik were not just risking death, they were stepping into legal and moral ambiguity. Training emphasized discipline and timing. The success of a Q-ship depended on waiting until the submarine was close enough to ensure accurate gunfire. That often meant absorbing an initial torpedo strike or shelling without immediately responding. The crew had to endure the shock of explosions, the possibility of fire, and the instinct to fight back too soon. Only when the submarine was fully exposed would Hicks give the order to drop the disguise and open fire. There was another uncomfortable reality. Q-ships historically suffered high casualty rates. In both world wars, many had been sunk before they could effectively spring their trap. Once a submarine realized it was facing an armed decoy, it could respond with overwhelming force. A single well-placed torpedo could cripple a converted merchant vessel beyond recovery. Unlike heavily armored warships, Atik lacked the structural resilience of a purpose-built combat ship. Despite these dangers, morale aboard Atik remained steady as she prepared for deployment. Many crew members viewed their mission as innovative and bold. Instead of passively waiting for submarines to strike, they would take the fight to the enemy in an unexpected way. There was pride in that idea. There was also an unspoken awareness that they were participating in an experiment. As Atik completed her modifications and sea trials, the Atlantic War continued to intensify. German submarines operated with confidence along the American coastline, exploiting gaps in defense. Each successful sinking reinforced the perception that U-boats controlled the initiative. Project LQ aimed to disrupt that confidence, to introduce uncertainty into the mind of every submarine commander scanning the horizon. Yet uncertainty cut both ways. If Atik failed, the consequences would extend beyond a single ship. The loss of a Q-ship could strengthen German resolve and expose American desperation. It could prove that deception was no substitute for comprehensive convoy systems and improved anti-submarine technology. When Atik finally sailed into the Atlantic, she carried concealed weapons, a carefully rehearsed crew, and the weight of a classified experiment. Somewhere beyond the horizon, seasoned commanders like Hardegen continued their patrols, unaware that at least one of their potential targets was not what it seemed. The stage was set for a test of nerves, timing, and deadly calculation. In the silent contest between hunter and decoy, one mistake would be enough to decide everything.
By late March 1942, the Atlantic Ocean had become a battlefield without visible armies. There were no trenches, no front lines, only empty horizons and the constant possibility of sudden destruction. German submarines moved silently beneath the surface, striking merchant ships with torpedoes and disappearing before help could arrive. Into these dangerous waters sailed USS Atik, a vessel designed not merely to endure the hunt, but to turn it against the hunter. Atik looked ordinary by design. She resembled a slow-moving cargo freighter, the kind that carried coal or general supplies along the American coastline. Her paint scheme was unremarkable, her deck showed no obvious weapons. Lifeboats hung in plain sight. To any submarine commander scanning the horizon, she appeared vulnerable, perhaps even easy prey. But beneath that disguise, hidden behind cleverly engineered panels, were naval guns ready to be revealed at a moment's notice. Ammunition was stored behind false bulkheads. Depth charges were concealed within compartments that could be accessed quickly. Her crew had rehearsed their roles repeatedly. If attacked, some sailors would simulate panic, lowering lifeboats to make the ship appear abandoned. Others would remain hidden at their battle stations, waiting for the order to transform the illusion into a trap. Meanwhile, far below the surface, Kapitänleutnant Reinhard Hardegen commanded U-123 with growing confidence. Hardegen was one of Germany's most successful U-boat captains, operating off the American coast during Operation Drumbeat. In the early months of 1942, U-boats had found American shipping dangerously exposed. Cities along the coast often remained brightly lit at night, silhouetting merchant ships against the skyline. Convoy systems were not yet fully implemented. For commanders like Hardegen, the Atlantic off the United States felt like an open hunting ground. On March 26, 1942, the paths of U-123 and Atik crossed, roughly 300 miles off Virginia. The sea was vast and indifferent, but fate had aligned predator and decoy within striking distance. Through his periscope, Hardegen observed what appeared to be a lone merchant vessel. No escort vessels were visible. The ship did not zigzag aggressively. There was no obvious sign of armament. It looked like the dozens of freighters U-123 had already sent to the bottom. Inside the submarine's control room, calculations were made with methodical precision. Speed, angle, distance, numbers spoken quietly in the dim red lighting. A torpedo was prepared. Compressed air hissed. The weapon left its tube and sped silently through the water toward its target. Moments later, the torpedo struck Atik. The explosion tore into the ship's hull with brutal force. Steel plates buckled. Debris flew across the deck. Smoke poured upward into the gray sky. Below decks, compartments flooded rapidly. The shock wave rippled through every section of the vessel. For a conventional merchant ship, this would have been the beginning of the end. But for a Q-ship, it was the beginning of the performance. On deck, sailors moved according to plan. Some appeared to panic, rushing toward lifeboats. Others shouted and gestured as though confused and overwhelmed. Lifeboats were lowered into the water. The ship seemed crippled, vulnerable, and close to surrender. Inside U-123, Hardegen faced a familiar decision. Submarines carried limited torpedoes. When a target appeared mortally wounded, it was often more efficient to surface and finish the job with the deck gun. Surfacing allowed better visibility and conserved valuable torpedoes for future encounters. From his perspective, the damaged freighter looked like an easy conclusion to another successful attack. U-123 rose slowly from beneath the waves and broke the surface. In that moment, the balance shifted. A surfaced submarine was powerful but exposed. Its hull sat above water, vulnerable to gunfire. For Lieutenant Commander Harry Linwood Hicks aboard Atik, this was the precise scenario Project LQ had been designed to create. The enemy had revealed himself. Timing was critical. The submarine needed to be close enough for effective gunfire, but not so close that additional torpedoes could be launched instantly. Amid smoke and fire, Hicks gave the order. Panels dropped away from Atik's deck structures. Concealed naval guns swung into position. What seconds earlier had appeared to be cargo fixtures transformed into artillery. The illusion shattered. Atik opened fire. Shells roared across the narrow stretch of ocean separating the two vessels. Water erupted around U-123 as rounds splashed close to its hull. The element of surprise had been achieved. German sailors scrambled to respond, shocked by the sudden transformation of their target. Hardegen reacted quickly. U-123's deck gun crew returned fire. The submarine maneuvered to reduce its profile while maintaining offensive capability. The exchange was chaotic and violent. Smoke drifted across the sea. Flames licked at Atik's damaged sections. The Atlantic, moments earlier empty and silent, had become a close-range battlefield. But Atik was already gravely wounded. The initial torpedo strike had compromised her structural integrity. Fires burned below decks. Ammunition was being handled under extreme pressure. Each recoil of her guns strained an already damaged hull. Then came the decisive blow. Another torpedo struck Atik. The explosion was catastrophic. The weakened ship could not withstand a second impact. Fire surged through internal compartments. Ammunition stores detonated in chain reactions. The deck buckled. Thick smoke enveloped the vessel, turning her into a floating inferno. Despite the bravery and precision of her crew, the physics of war favored the submarine. A converted cargo ship, no matter how cleverly disguised, could not match the resilience of a purpose-built naval combatant once fatally damaged. U-123, though shaken by the ambush, remained operational. Hardegen assessed the situation and withdrew as Atik burned uncontrollably. The trap had sprung, but it had not destroyed the hunter. As flames consumed the vessel, the outcome became inevitable. The Atlantic closed over the wreckage, taking with it 141 American sailors. In the span of a single encounter, innovation, courage, deception, and tragedy collided on the open sea. The experiment had nearly succeeded. The surprise was real, but modern submarine warfare was unforgiving. And the ocean, as always, kept its secrets. Flames climbed higher as the mortally wounded USS Atik drifted in the dark Atlantic. The second torpedo had done what the first could not. It broke the ship's spine. Compartments flooded rapidly. Ammunition stored for the ambush detonated in violent bursts, sending fragments and shockwaves through an already crippled hull. What had begun as a calculated deception had become a fight for survival. On the surface nearby, U-123 maneuvered cautiously. Kapitänleutnant Reinhard Hardegen had experienced the shock of being fired upon by what appeared to be a harmless merchantman. But now the situation had shifted again. The American vessel was ablaze, clearly doomed. The risk of remaining too close, especially if ammunition continued exploding, was real. A damaged Q-ship could still be dangerous in its final moments. Inside Atik, chaos reigned. Fires spread through passageways. Smoke choked lower compartments. Damage control teams struggled to contain flooding, but the structural damage was catastrophic. The ship listed heavily. Communications were disrupted. Power failed in sections of the vessel. The carefully rehearsed plan, the timing, the deception, the sudden reveal no longer mattered. The fight had moved beyond tactics into raw endurance. The tragedy of a Q-ship was built into its design. Unlike a purpose-built warship, Atik lacked heavy armor and reinforced bulkheads. She had been a civilian cargo vessel, adapted for combat, but never truly engineered for sustained battle. Once hit decisively, she had little margin for recovery. The very disguise that made her effective as bait also made her fragile under concentrated attack. As explosions rippled through the ship, some crew members attempted to abandon her, but abandoning a burning vessel in open Atlantic waters hundreds of miles from shore offered no guarantee of survival. Lifeboats could be destroyed by secondary blasts. Oil fires could spread across the surface. In the darkness and confusion, coordination became nearly impossible. German accounts later indicated that U-123 observed the burning ship for a period before withdrawing. Hardegen had to weigh multiple factors: the possibility of American reinforcements, the risk of hidden weaponry still operational, and the need to preserve his submarine for continued patrol. His mission was not to linger in spectacle, but to sink tonnage and survive to fight again. Eventually, U-123 slipped beneath the waves, leaving the inferno behind. For the man aboard Atik, time ran out. The fires reached critical stores. A massive internal explosion tore through the vessel, sealing her fate. The ship broke apart and disappeared into the Atlantic, taking all 141 crew members with her. There were no confirmed survivors, no distress calls that reached friendly forces in time. Only debris and oil marked the site of the battle. Back in the United States, the loss was not immediately understood in full detail. Atik's mission had been highly classified under Project LQ. Even within naval circles, knowledge of her true role was limited. Initial reports simply listed her as missing. Families received sparse information. The circumstances of the engagement, its deception, its brief exchange of gunfire, and its catastrophic end remained buried within confidential files. The Navy faced an uncomfortable assessment. The Q-ship had achieved tactical surprise. It had drawn a seasoned U-boat commander into surfacing and opened fire at close range, but surprise alone had not guaranteed victory. Modern submarines carried sufficient firepower to respond decisively, and a single additional torpedo could erase any advantage gained through deception. There were also broader strategic lessons. By mid-1942, the United States was accelerating the implementation of convoy systems along the East Coast. Air patrol coverage increased. Radar and sonar improvements enhanced detection capabilities. Escort vessels were reassigned and newly constructed. These measures, though not immediate solutions, addressed the systemic weaknesses that had allowed submarines such success during Operation Drumbeat. In that evolving context, the Q-ship concept appeared increasingly risky and resource-intensive for uncertain gain. Each converted vessel required secrecy, specialized crews, and the willingness to accept extreme vulnerability. The loss of Atik forced planners to confront whether such experiments justified their cost in lives. For decades, the story remained largely untold. The men who sailed aboard Atik were not celebrated in headlines. Their mission was secret, their battle brief and chaotic. Unlike major fleet engagements, there were no dramatic photographs, no widely broadcast radio reports. The Atlantic swallowed both the ship and much of the public memory surrounding it. Yet within naval archives and German war diaries, fragments of the encounter endured. Hardegen's patrol reports recorded the strange battle with an armed merchantman that fought back before succumbing. American documentation, once declassified, revealed the ambition behind Project LQ and the calculated risk accepted by Lieutenant Commander Harry Linwood Hicks and his crew. The battle demonstrated a harsh truth about innovation in wartime. Bold ideas can shift momentum, but they can also expose new vulnerabilities. Atik's final engagement was not a meaningless failure. It was a costly lesson written in fire. It underscored the need for layered defense, coordinated convoys, and technological superiority rather than isolated acts of deception. In the cold waters off the Virginia coast, the experiment ended. One ship vanished, one submarine continued its patrol, and the Atlantic War pressed on, indifferent to individual sacrifice. In the immediate aftermath of the sinking of USS Atik, there was no public reckoning, no dramatic headline announcing a desperate last stand in the Atlantic. Instead, there was silence. The mission had been conceived under strict secrecy as part of Project LQ, and that secrecy did not end with the ship's destruction. Official records were restricted. Details were compartmentalized. For the families of the 141 lost sailors, the information was limited, often painfully vague. The United States Navy understood that revealing the full story carried risks. Publicly acknowledging the use of disguised warships could invite controversy under international law and potentially provoke German retaliation against legitimate merchant vessels. Q-ships occupied a gray zone in naval warfare, legally defensible under certain interpretations, yet controversial enough to spark diplomatic tension. Keeping the operation classified protected not only strategic details, but also broader wartime messaging. Meanwhile, the Battle of the Atlantic intensified. German submarines continued to operate aggressively through the spring of 1942, capitalizing on early American disorganization during Operation Drumbeat. However, change was already underway. Convoy systems were implemented along the East Coast. Merchant vessels began sailing under escort. Coastal blackouts reduced nighttime visibility. Long-range patrol aircraft extended coverage over vulnerable shipping lanes. Gradually, the balance began to shift. In that shifting environment, the Q-ship experiment appeared increasingly out of step with the direction of modern naval warfare. Submarines were relying less on surfacing and more on submerged torpedo attacks. Radar technology improved on both sides. Sonar detection became more reliable. Escort carriers and dedicated anti-submarine vessels brought coordinated force to the ocean battlefield. The era in which a disguised merchantman could reliably lure a submarine into a surface duel was fading. Within naval analysis circles, Atik's loss became a case study. The ship had succeeded in achieving surprise against an experienced commander, Kapitänleutnant Hardegen, aboard U-123. The hidden guns had opened fire. The deception had functioned as designed. But the structural vulnerability of a converted cargo ship, combined with the firepower and resilience of a modern submarine, proved decisive. The lesson was stark. Tactical ingenuity could not compensate for fundamental imbalance in protection and durability. For Lieutenant Commander Harry Linwood Hicks and his crew, that lesson came at the ultimate cost. Yet their mission was not without impact. The willingness to experiment, to challenge conventional doctrine, reflected a Navy adapting under extreme pressure. Wartime innovation often involves failure before success. The broader anti-submarine campaign that eventually secured the Atlantic drew upon many such experiments, some triumphant, others tragic. As the war progressed, Allied forces gained the upper hand at sea. Coordinated intelligence, including code-breaking efforts, improved convoy routing, technological advances like improved depth charges, ahead-throwing weapons, and airborne radar narrowed the submarine's advantage. By 1943, German U-boat losses mounted at unsustainable rates. The Atlantic, once a hunting ground for submarines, became increasingly perilous for them instead. For decades after the war, the story of Atik remained largely absent from popular histories. Major fleet battles and decisive campaigns dominated public memory. The quiet, experimental missions, especially those that ended in loss, were often overshadowed. It was only later, through careful archival research and analysis by historians such as Michael Gannon, that the episode received fuller examination. By comparing American naval records with German war diaries, researchers reconstructed the encounter in detail, restoring the narrative of what happened 300 miles off the Virginia coast. The rediscovery of Atik's story invites broader reflection. Warfare at sea is often portrayed as a contest of massive fleets and dramatic engagements, yet much of it unfolds in isolation, small crews making high-stakes decisions far from public view. The Q-ship program embodied both creativity and vulnerability. It sought to exploit human expectation, to turn routine procedure into fatal miscalculation. In Atik's case, the gamble came close to succeeding, but ultimately collided with the unforgiving realities of modern naval combat. Today, the loss of 141 sailors aboard Atik stands as a reminder of the hidden dimensions of war. Not every sacrifice is accompanied by fanfare. Not every experiment produces victory. Yet each contributes to the evolution of strategy and technology that shapes future outcomes. The Atlantic campaign was won not by a single breakthrough, but by cumulative adaptation, learning from failure as much as from triumph. Beneath the waters where Atik sank, the wreck remains a silent testament to that moment of bold ambition. The ship that was designed to deceive, to lure and strike unexpectedly, instead became part of the ocean's vast history. Her mission, once classified and nearly forgotten, now occupies a place in the broader story of the Battle of the Atlantic, a story defined by endurance, innovation, and the relentless contest between stealth and survival. In remembering Atik, we remember more than a failed experiment. We remember the courage required to sail deliberately into danger, the complexity of fighting an unseen enemy, and the hard lessons that helped transform vulnerability into eventual strength.